Thank you so much. I appreciate being here today. My name is Dr. Richelle Marynowski, Oki, and welcome. I come to you from Treaty 7 territory, home of the Blackfoot people, and just absolutely thrilled to be here talking to you today about curriculum. So the things that we are going to talk about today, we've got four main topics. We've got current curriculum theory, brain research, developing critical thinking skills, and teaching best practices. So we'll go through each of those. There's time for questions. If you want to ask questions in the chat along the way, or you want to raise your hand, please feel free to do so as well. So when we talk about curriculum theory, we're talking about the designing and the development of curriculum, what students need to know and be able to do. There are curriculum theorists that talk about programs of study being overloaded with outcomes. So teachers feel compelled to cover content rather than teach in ways that would allow students to develop deep understandings. The goal, the current thinking about curriculum theory, is that it's really important to design the curriculum so that there's time for students to develop those deep understandings. What's really important is that they come away from the curriculum or from our school system with a really deep understanding of thinking, of making connections, and alongside knowledge and skills. What is really important is that there's a strong alignment between the content or the goals of the formal curriculum, so what we're being assigned to teach, the teaching resources, and the assessments. All three of those need to be in line so that there's continuity and consistency between the three parts. What is also really important is that there's deep learning rather than surface learning of information, facts, and formulas. That should be the aim for education, the deep learning rather than the surface learning. Surface learning, things we can find, we can search out, we can ask our neighbor about, we can ask our friends about, but the deep learning is the connections between things and being able to link all of the items and all of the knowledge together rather than the knowledge on its own. Deep understanding requires that students have a repository of factual knowledge and the ability to use that knowledge to develop interpretations, arguments, and come to reasoned conclusions. So there is necessarily both factual knowledge and the ability to use that knowledge. So we can't have deep learning or deep understanding without some facts or some content pieces. And then we also need to have the ability or knowledge to develop interpretations and arguments, to be able to say whether a piece of information is important or not important, or linked to other pieces of information. One of the things that I think about when I think about deep learning and factual knowledge is I think that in our brains, we have places that we can hold information, but we need to have links that we can link that other information to. So that's one really important piece. So deep understanding, not surface learning. There needs to be time embedded so that we can attend to the deep learning and make connections between understandings for students. So what does that look like in a curriculum? So that looks like outcomes that focus on integrating learning, knowledge acquisition alongside using and analyzing and being able to transfer that knowledge. So it's not about knowledge for knowledge's sake, but using that knowledge then to understand the world around us and understand us as human beings. Space in the curriculum that allows for time to spend on developing more complex understandings. So there needs to be time so that we can make those links. Rushing through a curriculum or a curriculum that is full, that teachers and students don't feel like they can have time to explore, make connections, is not useful. It's not what we want our goals to be for an educated Albertan. There also needs to be connections between content areas where knowledge in one area builds on another area and has coherence between curricular areas. There is definitely individual curricular knowledge, ways of talking about the curriculum, ways of talking about the content, but there does need to be a coherence between the curricular areas. It's important that what we're doing in language arts and social studies and science and mathematics and fine arts, wellness, all link together so that students have a whole experience with their education, not a whole bunch of separate experiences. So the connections between content areas are really important. When you develop curriculum in isolation from each other, then you get content that is misaligned, so that when a student needs a particular understanding in one area, it's not taught in a different area until way later or way earlier, and it's not an appropriate time for that. So the coherence between curricula is really important. When we talk about brain research, we talk about students developing cognitive schema so they can place new knowledge in a relationship with what they already know. Therefore, they need to know some things and have placed this knowledge into a conceptual structure. So knowledge in isolation does not help. There needs to be a schema, a structure, connections. I don't know if this is appropriate or not, but I've always imagined learning new things that I need to have like little hooks in my brain that I need to hang those things on in order to keep them. Otherwise they slip away. If I don't have any place to hold, to hold the information, those things slip away. And so having a schema, a structure, visual representation, flow charts, webs, those sorts of things that help students make sense of the new things they are learning in relation to the things they already know. Because children don't come to us as blank slates. They come to us with knowledge already. And so being able to place that knowledge in concert with the things that we are asking them to learn in our classrooms helps deepen and strengthen that learning. Additionally, deep understanding of subject matter can transform factual information into usable knowledge. Again, the usable knowledge. I need to be able to draw on knowledge in order to make conjectures, in order to defend my choices. So a deep understanding of the connections within the knowledge can make that knowledge then usable. And brain research says that we need to be able to apply meaningfully learned knowledge and skills flexibly and creatively in different situations. And this is where I've seen a struggle in my own classrooms teaching Mathematics 30 to students, that students, when preparing for a diploma exam, when we're reviewing, they would say like, well, I've never seen that kind of question before. And I would tell them that I can't possibly tell you all of the different ways that, all the different kinds of questions that you might see or have to use this knowledge in. My goal is to give you the base, the structure, and then you have to draw on that knowledge and apply it in flexible and creative ways. So there isn't a cookie cutter way to do all of the things. And so we need to be able to help our students apply their knowledge in flexible and creative and different situations. So that's what brain research tells us leads to deep learning and deep understanding. So again, what does that look like in a curriculum? That there are knowledge structures and schema that help us to connect information to already known information and structures. So we need to draw on the learning from before so that we can help embed their new learning in that schema and in that structure. So it's really important to have that coherence then across the curriculum so that it's building as we move forward. Of course, we know that new things will be introduced, but we have to make way or make sense of that in concert to what we already know. And that there's a building of complexity in the schema and knowledge structures to enhance that conceptual understanding. So as I noted in the chat, there was many comments about the building of conceptual understanding. Well, conceptual understanding is really hard to assess. It's not as easy, it's not as quick. It takes longer to build than straight knowledge and facts. So sometimes there's a tendency to go towards knowledge and facts because it's easier to see and it's easier to assess. But that doesn't mean that that's where we should spend the majority of our time. So there's really important ways to get at the complexity and the building of conceptual understanding. So conceptual and factual are built together. So these things definitely need to go together. It's not one or the other. I totally resist when it says, well, we have to focus on this without seeing this. And I don't think that's fair. I think we need both of these building together because that is how we retain the factual knowledge, is by building our conceptual knowledge and vice versa. And that knowledge needs to be applied in new contexts. So that is really key. And when I talk about context and specifically thinking about the mathematics, saying word problems or problem solving, the problem solving is a new context, not necessarily putting words around the mathematics that we want students to be able to do, but applying a schema or a process in new contexts. And that to me is really key. The next is developing critical thinking skills. In really each of the elements that I've talked about already lead to the development of critical thinking skills. So teaching critical thinking is effective if certain conditions are met. Creating learning situations and necessary time allocation, which is something we've talked about already, is the time allocation. That there's an encouragement of children to think independently, to speculate, to ponder. And that is really important. They need to be able to hypothesize. They need to be able to ponder. They need to be able to think of things independently. There needs to be an acceptance of a diversity of opinions and ideas so that others have different opinions, have different experiences, and there's a knowledge of the diversity of those. That there's active involvement by the confrontation of ideas, cooperation and collaboration in finding appropriate solutions. So there's an active confrontation ideas. How do you know that? Why do you know that? Where does that come from? How does that fit? And not letting students off the hook for saying, well, I just know it, but digging deeper into how they know something and why they know something. And the cooperation and collaboration. So learning doesn't happen in isolation. It can happen in collaboration and through talking to each other. And belief that children will not be ridiculed for their opinions. That is a really important thing in our schools and in our systems, in our society, is that we honor opinions, but then also push back at them as opinion and make them recognize when it is opinion or when it is what it is based on. That really helps with a knowledgeable society. And that every student, has a confidence in their ability to think critically, that they can think critically, and that there's an appreciation of critical thinking, that it's an important thing. Trying to talk to my 15-year-old son about critical thinking, and when he says, well, I just know that, that's what it just is. And so trying to push back at him and say, well, how and why? Where does that come from? To get him to think more deeply about why he's saying the things he's saying. And that, again, can happen at all levels. This particular article was based in early elementary. And so these are the ideas these are what they developed through talking to early elementary children and teaching. So again, what does that look like? So that looks like children thinking independently. And some of these things are really difficult when we want children to learn particular things. If we've got a children that's an independent thinker, sometimes that causes grief to us, but we still want them to think independently, yet be able to follow classroom norms and societal norms at times. Children making hypotheses and generalizing. I think there is a teacher on here that I know that had her students in mathematics, making hypotheses, making conjectures in kindergarten, grade 1. They can do these things. We just have to support them in it. Children debating and working together to find solutions. It's about not saying that my ideas are better than yours, but working together and debating. Analyzing to make conclusions, accepting different perspectives and experiences, and making connections between ideas and topic. Arshleen, I appreciate your point about teaching religion in the social studies curriculum, being asked to critically evaluate. Public education is supposed to be secular, but we do have to honor, though, that there are a variety of religious beliefs in our world and in our students' experiences. So it's about perhaps learning about them and honoring what makes them different and what makes them similar, and honoring the traditions. And I don't know enough about religions that I don't feel that I can do that very well. So I really respect that point. Yeah, some people make the argument that young children don't have the facts to use critical thinking, and I think that's really unfortunate thinking, um, because students have the ability as young as before kindergarten to think critically, to make decisions, to post conjectures. Um, I, my son was very good at compromise. Uh, if I do this, can this happen? Or what if I do this? Can I get this toy that I really want? What if? So very, very good at an early age at doing compromise and thinking and concluding and perspectives. Critical thinking does require risk taking. And so that's one of the things. The risk taking is my space. So is my space comfortable enough for students to take the risk? And I had a conversation with a colleague the other day, and this is at post-secondary, where he said, as a teacher, I like to have students working in groups, and I like to pop into their conversations and listen to them and draw on threads that are everywhere. But sometimes I feel like I need to back away from that and let them try on ideas without my interference. Let them work through some of the things that they're thinking through without me being there immediately. I think that's a really important thing to think about, is sometimes they need the space without us there to try on their ideas and try on their perspectives. This is the teaching best practices. And so there's this slide and another slide. So there's 4 different things to take a look at. So that there's the content, there's domain knowledge, which is subject matter specific concepts, facts, and procedures. So there is knowledge that is specific to each subject matter. And there is then heuristic strategies. So generally applicable techniques for accomplishing tasks that are above, perhaps broader than the specific domain, so they can apply across. And then there's control strategies, general approaches for directing one's solution process. So how do I go through finding a solution to whatever it is? And then learning strategies, so knowledge about how to learn new concepts, facts, and procedures. And then there's the how. Okay, so there's the content, and then there's the method. So ways to promote the development of expertise. So these are different ways, and they're not necessarily in a hierarchy, and we don't have to go through these. We must model first, coach second, scaffold third. It's not how this is intended, but these are ways that all of these should be a part of our teaching repertoires in order to get to the critical thinking and to get to deep understanding. So getting students to reflect and getting students to pose and solve their own problems, getting students to teach other children things. So the modeling is a great way for students to learn, but then they also need to have practice. They also need to verbalize their knowledge and their thinking. That's one of the hardest things for students to do in many cases, to verbalize how they know something, why they know something, and how they know something works. So doing that verbalization. And that really fits into assessment practices where you focus on conversations, observations, and products. That's, to me, is the triangulation of assessment that Ann Davies talks about. I just almost forgot her name. And so we really need to get to those pieces, that it's not just products, it's conversations and observations as well. And the next part about the teaching best practices, that the keys to ordering learning activities, the sequencing. So we want like global before local skills. So whole task before executing the parts, which is different than how I remember teaching and thinking about laying out an example for mathematics classes. I focused on the parts before the conceptualization, and students would get lost in the parts and not be able to see the whole picture. So once I started talking about, well, this is the goal of this is what we're focusing on, is being able to attend to this big thing. And these are the pieces that go into that. That to me is laying out the hooks for students to then hook the individual knowledge on and hold on to. And meaningful tasks gradually increase in difficulty and complexity. That doesn't mean necessarily, that has to be less complex in kindergarten, but the start of kindergarten is less complex than the start of grade 1. And we can still have complex things. It's just based in their grade level. And practice a variety of situations to emphasize broad applications. So not only complexity, but diversity. And then when we think about the sociology, the social characteristics of learning environments, learning does not happen in a void. Learning happens in a community, that there's cooperation, that there's intrinsic motivation, and that there's situated learning. So in the context of working on realistic tasks, students communicate different ways to accomplish. There's personal goals. When we talk about assessment practices, we talk about assessment as learning. So we talk about students reflecting on their learning and how they seek solutions and how they're going to help themselves learn. That's all embedded in all of this as well. So each of these pieces together, integrating into our learning context and into our classrooms, helps build on the depth of knowledge that students can learn, and helps build on the critical thinking skills that we want students to learn. So again, I'm going to pause there. That's really the end of my presentation. The last slide is the references, so that you can seek out further information if you so choose to.